Hello and welcome to The Menu, Monocle Radio's food and drink programme. I'm your host, Chiara Rimella. Coming up, with the beginning of a brand new year, it's only natural to spend some time reflecting on our habits and how to improve them. And that includes our eating and drinking too. It's not necessarily just about limiting ourselves, but about having a more conscious, ethical and positive approach to what we consume. First up, we sit down with an author tracing the philosophy of food around the world.
I don't believe future generations will look back and think we were terrible to eat meat, but I think they will look back and think it's terrible the way we kept a lot of that meat.
Also on the programme, we drop into a dedicated mocktail bar in Canada.
The bar is really the perfect combination of everything. It allows us the flexibility to be creative, to be inspired by what's growing in the garden. And if we only have 10 portions of something, because that's all the garden made, that's it.
Plus, we speak to a Danish gastrophysicist who wants you to eat your greens. All that here in The Menu on Monocle Radio. Deciding how we eat doesn't just have consequences for ourselves and our well-being, but crucially for the health of our planet and our communities. Every single ingredient we choose, every lunch or dinner out, feeds into a complex global system that is so all-encompassing it can feel hard to comprehend. But philosopher and author Julian Baggini has tried to do just that, compiling a survey of the world's food systems from small farms in Bhutan to grocery shops in the UK via hunter-gatherers in Tanzania and food policy in Finland. From small farms in Bhutan to grocery shops in the UK via hunter-gatherers in Tanzania and food policy in Finland. In his book, titled How the World Eats, A Global Food Philosophy, he identifies the dilemmas that humanity must contend with every time they have a meal. The result is an accessible read that encourages authorities, businesses small and big, and consumers to reconsider what our culinary world should achieve. Earlier, Sebastian Stevenson met with Julian and started by asking him about the book's founding principles.
Okay, well, there are 7. To give a sort of a detailed run through them would take probably more time than we've got. Now, I'd say 5 of them are actually things that you simply read off from what's worked in the past. A couple of them are related. There's a principle of circularity and a principle of holism. And you could say they're 2 sides of the same coin, which is we have to think at the systems level about food. We can't just think about, is this farm efficient? Because you have to look about what's coming into that farm from off the farm, what that farm is putting out into the environment, how it's affecting wildlife populations. So circularity and holism are really to do with the need for systems thinking. Another principle is around ingenuity, inventiveness, creativity, because human beings have actually been incredibly ingenious in how they managed to get food from the land, from the sea, from rivers. And that's really been our great advantage. And the reason I think that needs stressing is that too many people think that our problems are solely problems created by industrialization, technology, etc., etc. If only we could go back to doing things in the old-fashioned ways, everything would be lovely. But the old-fashioned ways were themselves, at one point, innovations. And they were innovations that human beings came up with to confront the challenges of their time. Now, the challenges of our time are going to require a continued innovation. We can't just fall back on the way people used to live. Take an obvious one. If people think you'd like to go back to hunter-gathering, well, you need to kill off 94% of our population because it requires huge amounts of land. So that idea of resourcefulness is really important. Yeah, an important principle is pluralism. By pluralism, we mean not anything goes, but there are different ways of farming, of eating, of organising food systems that work. And the idea that we've got to find the way that suits everyone is just misguided. So, for example, the Mediterranean diet is often held up to be the ideal diet for humanity. That's too simplistic because it's clearly not the diet that people have eaten in various parts of the world. The Japanese have very good life expectancy. They don't eat the Mediterranean diet. They eat quite a lot of white rice, actually, which, a lot of people today would say that's very bad because it's, high in high glycemic index, etc. But it's not. They have a diet. They have a dietary pattern which, when you put all the different foods together, it works well for them. And it's the same with farming. There are some places where organics works really, really well, and we should probably be having much more organics. But the idea that every farmer should be organic, again, that's too simplistic because there are some places where, for want of just a little bit of insecticide used carefully, you could have much, much more yield, and it's kind of crazy not to use it. So pluralism is really important. There's a principle of food centrism, which it's a bit of an ugly word, but basically the idea here is that you've got to have proper whole foods at the basis of your system and of your diet. And at the moment, that's not the case because the food system is basically geared towards producing raw ingredients to be used, sold as commodities, to be used as raw ingredients in often ultra-processed or highly processed foods. Most of the food being produced in the world is not food that is just going to be eaten in any straightforward way. It's an industrial ingredient. And so similarly, our diets are not based on whole foods. Over 60% of calories in the typical British diet come from ultra-processed foods. So we haven't got those whole foods at our centre. And again, all over the world, people eat very, very differently. But when they eat, basically whole foods and all parts of the animal and a good diversity, they tend to do pretty well for health, right? And when they transition to a diet which has fewer of those things, their health gets worse. But there are two principles which I don't think we can just go back to history to justify. They're principles which I think we need to uphold because, of what we now know, what we've learned, the principles that we have come out the Enlightenment and so forth. One of them is compassion towards other animals. At the moment, the industrial farming system is very, very short on it. I think some of the practices which we have in animal husbandry around the world are barbaric and awful. And I don't believe future generations will look back and think we were terrible to eat meat, but I think they will look back and think it's terrible the way we kept a lot of that meat. And the other one is the way we treat human beings in the food system, because actually for a very, very long time, a lot of food has been produced by slaves, or if not slaves, people in very, very poor conditions, bonded labour, ill-treated, and that is still endemic throughout the system. It's a feature of the system, not a bug, and this is a problem we got. The food prices we have in developed countries are by historical standards very, very low, and that all depends upon the fact that a lot of the people involved in the production are getting a really raw deal. And I think the philosophical argument why that shouldn't be the case, and we have to change that, and that's going to be a challenge because it's so much part of the fabric of the system.
Maybe if we could go away from the world for a moment. You go to many different parts of the world, as you mentioned, as well. But one is you do actually end up going out into the International Space Station. And maybe you kind of reveal that, yes, obviously food stuff, it's all about the food stuff. But in a way it is eating it. There's much more to it for us as humans than just getting our nutrients as such.
I suppose you should point out I didn't literally go to the International Space Station, but yes, we went there in the book. I found this really interesting because, in space, food is fuel and it has to be treated as fuel, and it's got to be really good fuel. It's a very difficult job. So you've got like cutting edge science developing these foods, which have also got to meet all sorts of other requirements. They can't be crumbly. Crumbs can get into equipment. So you're very, very limited. They've got a very, very long shelf life. But the other thing is more social. The early space missions were not that long, and now people are spending months in space. And what they find is that it is much, much more important than just fuel. It gives them that, they have it's nostalgia, it's comfort, and it's sociability as well. When they share their meals in space, this is a really important part of it. And actually, similarly enough, I didn't mention in the book, but the same is true in submarines. Submarines can stay underwater for months at a time now. And the food is such an important part of the morale. People really look forward to the pizza night, whatever it might be, and the sharing, whatever it might be. And what also happens with astronauts is if the food isn't interesting or varied enough, they actually start consuming too few calories. They don't actually eat enough, which a rat won't actually. A rat will eat more if it's presented with novelty. It likes variety, but it won't eat less if it's got a monotonous diet. A human being will. And so it's actually important for our physical well-being that we enjoy our food. Otherwise, we don't eat properly as well. So I just think it's important to sort of see food not just as fuel. It goes back to that point of having this food-centric view of food. It's not fuel. It's not just nutrients that you add up. And so I get very sort of I despair when people think it'd be good to live off these Soylent shakes, which some people do. They think it's optimal nutrition. I don't think it is optimal nutrition because actually the form in which you ingest nutrients affects how you metabolize them and their healthiness. So I'm very skeptical that you can simply chuck in a load of the right nutrients in the right balance into a shake and drink it and get the same nutritional benefit as eating whole foods. But even if you could, that's taking away a lot of what really matters about food for us. I mean, I think things like Soylent are for that 10% of the population, I don't know what it is, that small minority who literally don't really care about food. Is just fuel for them. I'm not saying those people are wrong. If that's your temperament, that's fine. But the vast majority of human beings, food is much, much more than that.
So I suppose, what do you kind of hope from the book and obviously presenting all these different aspects of the food world. What do you kind of, I suppose, hope will come out of it? Or do you hope to inspire, say, people looking to get into food or to hospitality and having these sort of principles in mind when they're kind of conducting business or operating in the food world?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult not to have an aspiration which won't sound ridiculously sort of hubristic or whatever it might be. But I think one of the hopes I've got is that actually people stop being so tribal about this, right? I think that in order to make progress, we've got to stop seeing it as like a choice between, the free market or, total state regulation, between organics and regenerative or industrial agriculture, between everybody cooking everything from raw ingredients or processed foods, and recognize that all these binaries are far too simplistic, and that actually there's enough common purpose between people who do things in different ways that we can kind of converge on what we agree with.
Sebastian Stevenson there, speaking to philosopher and author Julian Baggini. This is The Menu. January tends to be the time of year when many hide their booze away in the cupboard as a way to detox from the holidays. But for some, going alcohol-free isn't just a New Year's resolution, but a year-round commitment. As people, particularly the younger generation, become more mindful about their alcohol consumption or abstain from it altogether, mocktails and 0% options are becoming ever more creative. Here, Monocle's contributing editor in Canada, Sheena Rossiter, takes us to Split Zero Proof, a new zero-alcohol bar in Edmonton that's stirring up new approaches to drinking.
On the west side of downtown Edmonton, some drinks are being mixed at a newly opened bar.
My name is Joanne Pierce. I am co-founder and CEO of Spilt Zero Proof, which is Alberta's first mocktail bar.
Spread across the black wooden bar, Joanne, who's one of 3 co-founders of Spilt Zero Proof, begins to mix one of her signature mocktails. The 80s-inspired space is snug. It's decorated with velvet powder pink bar stools with gold accents, which complement the dark green wood paneling on the front of the bar and the black and white tiled floor. Bursts of neon pink light fill the space from the bar signs. And even though not a drop of alcohol is served here, for Joanne, it's important that the space still resembles a good night out.
I wanted it to feel like a bar. I was a drinker. I know what a bar feels like. We wanted to help set the tone and lead the way, and that it's about flavor. It's not about deprivation. It's not about making 5-calorie drinks that have full adaptogenic function. We eventually found this little 300 square foot space in a hair salon.
For Joanne, it's been a journey to get here, both personally and professionally. She started making mocktails somewhat accidentally. It came during a time of change during the pandemic.
I just quit drinking on a whim, which makes it sound easy. It wasn't, but it was just a very sudden decision. I woke up one day feeling a little bit embarrassed. Like the shame over. I hadn't done anything bad, but just woke up being like, I don't want to feel this way anymore. And stopped drinking. But Andrew still drinks, my partner, and I wanted something to sip on at happy hour. And so my instinct was to boil everything in the house and turn it into simple syrup. A very witchy instinct, which I'm told is not normal. And I just started smashing all these syrups together in these really unusual combinations because there was no rules at the time. It was kind of the Wild West. This was in 2020. So I would do things like spruce tip and arugula syrup and, with muddled kiwi, and creating these lovely little potions and taking pictures of them, which was a hobby. And I put them online, and all of a sudden we got traction and realized, hey, nobody was taking up space in a meaningful way here, taking it seriously.
Alcohol-free bars are more than likely going to start to be the norm. The popularity of alcohol-free drinks has been on the rise since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, global alcohol sales dropped by more than 6% due to restrictions on socialization and the closures of hospitality venues. But it's also generational. Gen Z, the people who were born between the late 1990s and the early 2010s, drink 20% less than other generations did at their age. And other generations are seemingly cutting out alcohol for health reasons. Recently, south of the border in the United States, the U.S. Surgeon General has called for cancer warning labels to be put on alcohol bottles, saying that there's no safe level of alcohol consumption. And Joanne is seeing this cross-section of people in her clientele at the bar. She says that Spilt acts as a safe space for the queer community and for others who feel safe with no judgment of choosing not to drink.
Even in 2020, it was still a time where we would tend to pathologize anybody who wasn't drinking and immediately assume there was something wrong with them. So I didn't want everybody in my life to assume I was an alcoholic, even though I was drinking too much. But the reaction wasn't that at all. It wasn't judgmental. It was 100% supportive. People were really curious, and we realized there was just this whole untapped world that people weren't taking very seriously.
Joanne's venture into mocktails wasn't streamlined. At first, she made some cookbooks, but people found the recipes to be too complicated. She then started to collaborate with a local bitters company called Token Bitters. That is what helped her grow her business. She worked with them for 2.5 years, and she discovered where her strength lies. It's with the drinks and education.
With the bar, I don't owe anybody a recipe that's simple, like with the cookbooks. I also don't owe anybody shelf life. It doesn't have to be stable for 6 months at room temperature. The bar is really the perfect combination of everything. It allows us the flexibility to be creative, to be inspired by what's growing in the garden. And if we only have 10 portions of something, because that's all a garden made, that's it. Here we also have a chance to talk about some of the other exciting products that are out on the market, not just our own.
And here at Spilt Zero Proof, along with her 2 fellow co-founders, Joanne is putting those more complicated recipes to work.
My name is Andrew Paul, and I am a co-owner of Spilt Zero Proof.
Andrew, who's also Joanne's life partner, takes us through what's on the tasting menu for today.
We've laid out 3 different alcohol-free cocktails for us to try today. We have our Under the Apple Shrub, which is a apple, cardamom, Jerome, and whiskey little number. Then we have our Prairie Berry Patch, which is made with our house-made Prairie Berry Amaro that features locally sourced choke cherries, Hascaps, and cranberries with some lovely Noah Amaretto. And then over here we have one of the bottled products that Joe brought to market through the partnership with Token Bitters, and this is a Hascap Citrus Chili Sangria that we'll actually be doing in the style of a mimosa.
And as Andrew and Joanne have been coming up with these drinks, they explain, since there's no alcohol in the drinks, they think of them as an extension of food when bringing them together with all their flavors.
Mocktails are essentially an extension of food. So you can take the flavor profile of a dish and you can pull out certain components of that. And the question that we always come to the bar with is, how can we make this into a drink? So in the case of the Hascap Citrus Chili Mimosa, the duck sauce, had cinnamon and Hascaps and star anise, allspice, shallot, garlic, of course. So we pulled out the shallot and garlic and started playing with sort of its base spice components and the berry. And it's turned out to be an incredibly popular menu item for us here.
So what does that Hascap Citrus Chili Samosa pair well with?
Goes very well with duck. It has a nice sharp kind of tartness to it, so it cuts through anything that has a lot of heavy fat. So duck, for example, maybe some short ribs would be nice to kind of cut through that, the fat cap on some big old steaks.
After trying 3 different mocktails, the drinks that were presented to me were all reminiscent of everything from a walk in the forest to a unique twist on sweet and spicy. And for Joanne, that's exactly the point. Non-alcoholic drinks aren't boring. People just need to come with an open palate and mind. For Monocle Radio in Edmonton, I'm Sheena Rossiter.
Thanks, Sheena. This is the menu. Now it's time for the week's top food and drink headlines. Here is Monocle's Maisie Ringer.
Americans are increasingly turning to premium French flour for home baking, despite it costing up to 9 times more in the US than its standard supermarket equivalent. Exports of French flour to the US doubled in 2024, but could face a decline if incoming President Donald Trump imposes 25% tariffs on European imports, as he has threatened. The price of an espresso in Italy has risen by 15% in the last 3 years, reaching a national average of €1.18. In a country where the price of an espresso was once regulated by the state, Italians are accustomed to drinking some of the world's cheapest coffee, with locals and foreign tourists knocking back 6 billion shots of coffee in bars every year. But as global warming places unprecedented pressures on producers, coffee prices are expected to soar to €2. Whilst roasters have absorbed rising costs during the past 2 years, they insist they can no longer afford to, meaning bars will have to pay more for ground coffee. A pizzeria in the English city of Norwich is charging nearly €120 for a pineapple pizza in a bid to put customers off ordering it. The owners and staff of Lupa Pizza are so revolted by the divisive Hawaiian variant that they have reluctantly added the topping to their delivery menu, but only with the eye-watering price tag. The menu description reads, "Yeah, for £100 you can have it. Order the champagne too. Go on, you monster." Those are the week's food and drink headlines. Now back to Chiara.
Thanks, Maisie. You're listening to The Menu. Ever since childhood, most of us have it ingrained that eating more greens is healthier, not just for us, but for the planet too. But it isn't just children who balk at the challenge. Oftentimes, adults, particularly avid meat eaters, don't spend enough time figuring out how to make broccoli, kale and peas taste to their liking. Professor Ole Moritzen is a gastrophysicist at Copenhagen University and a world expert on umami. Recently, he published the results of a study of 50 million organic meal boxes delivered to Danish homes by the company Årstiderne. Over the past 6 years, the company has managed to replace some of the meat and carbs in their boxes with more vegetables and legumes through cunning deployment of the fifth taste, umami, in their recipes. Professor Moritzen has a couple of specific suggestions for making your greens tastier and more satisfying. Here, he tells our Denmark correspondent Michael Booth more.
So what we found was that it was actually possible to increase the amount of plant-based food, but not with these fast calories, in fact with some of the slow calories, in particular the legumes.
How are they doing it simply? What's the trick to getting the Danes, who love their pork famously, I think they eat more pork per capita than anyone else in the world, what's been the secret to very slowly weaning them off that meat habit?
I know it's difficult for people to eat more green. There's a reason why we have difficulty eating 500 to 600 grams of green every day, and the culprit is the taste. And it's because the green, by nature, by the biology of plants, they lack basic taste, sweet and umami, which is in our genes to look for. So when we have this wonderful data from the meal boxes, we can also look into the recipes that follow the meal boxes. I looked into the recipes, and I'm quite interested in where I find sources of natural sweetness and natural umami. And these chefs, they know what they're doing. There are very small tricks you can play in order to impart the so-called missing taste. And umami you'll get from, in our food culture, we're speaking from Denmark here, we have cheeses, we have various kinds of fermented fish, various kind of dairy product. Many of these products are rich in umami, but they're also something we can borrow from the Asian cuisines like soy sauce and miso, Japanese dashi, this wonderful soup broth that imparts really the essence of umami. You can use fungus. This is, of course, the rescue for many vegans. Dried fungus, shiitake is a sort of the king of mushrooms. And just small amounts. It could be in dressings, in sauces, in marinades. That will make a lot of green stuff go down without you feel lacking something. And I think that's a very important thing if you want to cut down on the meat and increase the plant-based part. People are supposed to feel that they're not missing anything after the meal. They should be satisfied.
Yeah, sated. Yeah.
Sated, and they should not feel that the meat has been taken away from them.
In the science of umami, which you're an absolute global expert on, they talk about this synergistic effect of combining some ingredients that have a kind of exponential impact on flavour and that feeling of feeling full and that you've had enough in Japanese food, as you mentioned, there's dashi, which combines mushrooms and kombu seaweed. And in Italian cooking, you have the famous Parmesan tomato combination. What would the equivalent be? Is there an equivalent in Danish and Scandinavian cooking, the Nordic kitchen that we've heard so much about?
Sometimes we just have to rediscover how our grandmothers and their mothers, how they cooked. And they would always keep the potato cooking water. It's a decent dashi. It has other flavors, but it has umami. And that's why in the old peasant cuisine in Nordic countries, you always use the potato water as a base for making gravies and dressings. And so I would say the modern version would be never throw out the potato water, but use it to steam your vegetables, just like in Asia we'd use the dashi to steam the vegetables.
And where do you stand on in many Asian households? Of course, they'll have a little jar of MSG, monosodium glutamate.
I see no problem using MSG, and it's the same molecular compound you find inside a ripe tomato or in fish sauce. The issue I find with MSG is that if you use it to disguise pure ingredients, that's not the way to go. And it's basically the same that we now have this terrible, basically global disaster by having a lot of foodstuff which is not really food, but give us the sensory cues as though it's food, but it's really poor carbohydrates. And MSG can, of course, be used to disguise poor ingredients.
Your research showed that these food boxes were managing to shift Danes' consumption patterns towards more green, but it's going to take a while to get where we need to be. Do you have any thoughts about how we can accelerate that even faster?
I think I have a clue to how we should actually do it if we had the time, and that is to change the school system such that the children learn how to deal with food and learn about food and how to cook. But that's a long haul. So the quick fixes I could think of would be that, and this is actually something I'm working on now, that is learning from Asian cultures to use sauces and condiments and marinades that are very rich in umami, preferably produced by local ingredients. So that could be from pulses, and it can also be from grains, where you, with small amounts, you can give a kick to your food. And it's basically similar to something like soy sauce or fish sauce, or something that is very potent and very flavorful and which is convenient to use. That would be a faster way to go.
I think about every country in the world has these sauces. In my homeland, we have Worcester sauce. In Mexico, they have mole. In France, you'll have a stock reduction. You know, they're everywhere, actually.
Yeah, everywhere, but a lot of it has been forgotten. And on the way it became forgotten was the people's focus on fats, because many of these sauces can be fatty. And that's really sort of a big problem. People are scared of fats. And this is, you're sort of throwing out the baby with the bathwater by then saying you don't want any sauces. And you can certainly also, if you want, make these sauces, very umami-rich sauces, without any fat whatsoever. I mean, the Japanese dashi is an example of basically a sauce or condiment that can be generally used to provide for better green, more delectable green food. Has no fat at all. I have one that everyone has at their table at home. That's ketchup. And ketchup is a very interesting example.
A lot of sugar, though, no?
No, but you know, originally ketchup was catsup. It was a Chinese or Malaysian fish sauce, and it went with British seafarers around the world, and they probably used it to pep up the tedious food on the ships. And then they came to other parts of the world where there were no tradition for fermenting fish, but you still were craving the umami, which is in fish sauce. So at some stage they started adding tomatoes and anchovies and walnuts. It's all umami-rich. Of course, now the trouble is the Americans spoiled it by adding a lot of sugars, but the old-fashioned ketchup was really umami bomb, also with some spices in, quite similar to what in Europe we would have in earlier days, and we're actually trying to rediscover this. We fermented fish called garum. And recently I unearthed and also wrote a bit about it. There was a combination in the old Roman cuisine where you combined garum, which is a fermented fish sauce, if you combine it with honey. And the Romans called it mealy garum. And it's very simple. You take fish sauce and mix it with honey, maybe a little bit of citrus, and then you have a condiment which is not fishy at all. Use that with greens. There's no fat in it. It's a very simple condiment which traditionally were only recommended in Roman and Greek dishes whenever you eat more vegetables.
Thank you, Michael. And that's all for this edition of The Menu. Remember that we are back with a new episode again on Friday at 2000 London time. That's a midday in San Francisco. Also, don't forget to tune into our spin-off show Food Neighborhoods for a tour of some of the world's tastiest destinations. I am Chiara Rimella. This program was produced by Monica Lillis and our sound engineer was Flynn Simons. Thanks for listening, and until next week.